less than 2 weeks ago, one of the great giants, Milton McGovern, 101 years old, a photographer, just died. And he was marvelous at documenting the daily lives of African Americans. But there are a whole bunch of Jewish artists. What is less well known is that there's another tradition of African American artists who've also sympathetically documented Jewish life. In Los Angeles, my late friend Ernie Barnes, who lived after his successful career in the National Football League, he came back and lived in the Jewish Fairfax district in Los Angeles for 5 years and was deeply committed to his Jewish friends and did a whole series of works really highlighting in a particularly positive way the Jewish tradition. And my friend William Pajot, now 85 years old, continues to do works on the Jewish tradition. There's a long, I don't have the time for an art historical discourse, but you could do an entire book on African American artists who have really cherished the Jewish tradition. So when I say look at the artists, there is an enormous kinship between African Americans and Jews. I know, and everybody knows, that there have been some tensions between the communities, but I would also add that in many, many decades of my teaching African American studies at UCLA, where everybody knows I'm Jewish, that has been a net positive, more than a net positive, in my own academic success.
Let me just ask all of you a question, then I'm going to turn to your questions. How many of you, prior to coming in here today, could have said more than 10 sentences about Arthur Szyk? That's great. So that's a wonderful response. How many of you own a Szyk Haggadah?
Well, we will.
A Szyk Haggadah for Passover? You do have one. It's on the bookshelf. You have it out? Okay, terrific. Now, here's how I like to handle questions. I'm a kind of old-fashioned, as you can imagine, and I'm of the school that a question is 1 or 2 sentences that ends with a question mark. It's not my whole life story, and again, I don't mean that in a degrading way by any means, but in a public forum, we want to get the most out of these 3 people, while Irv is all the way up here from Burlingame, Paul's up here from LA, Naomi's here from Albuquerque. In all seriousness, we want to get their views out. You all will be invited to the gallery afterwards, and we would love to hear more, but if you could keep your question to a sentence or 2, that would be great. So anybody, yes sir, tell me your name.
Izzy Mendel.
Izzy, please go ahead.
I get a little bit of Bosch and George Gross in some of his work. Would you please comment?
Sure.
Irv, you want to just repeat the question?
Sure. The question was, he gets a little bit of Bosch and a little bit of George Gross in Szyk's work. So do I. And I would say that, yes, I mean, in the gallery you'll see a Albrecht Dürer woodcut, and you'll also see Arthur Szyk's art that looks like a Dürer or Bosch or Bruegel, and you'll go into the gallery and you'll see an influence of Gross and Otto Dix, and you'll see that in Szyk's art. And if you go into the gallery, you're going to see ballet recess and costume design, and you'll see that in Arthur Szyk. And if you go there, you'll see Slavic and Polish folk art in Arthur Szyk, and you'll see early Zionist Tzalel art in Arthur Szyk, and you'll see caricature, and you'll see all of those, and from them he wove his own unique style. And I like to say to people that once you've seen Arthur Szyk's art, you're never going to forget it, you're never going to confuse him with any other artist, you always know it's Arthur Szyk. And that's part of not being part of any school of art, which has been difficult to accept because art historians like people in terms of how to relate them to others and the influence they've had on others. And yet, on the other hand, not being part of a school of art, you're sort of out there by yourself. You're sort of being forgotten. But I think he drew on all of these traditions and created his own unique styles.
Let's get some other questions. Yes, sir. What's your name?
I'm asking you, is there a catalog or is there a compendium of Arthur Szyk's work that one can take a look at in more detail than we saw even today?
Yeah, in the bookstore, there's an overview of Arthur Szyk called Justice Illuminate the Art of Arthur Szyk. And 2 years ago, there was a major exhibition of Arthur Szyk's art that was held in Berlin. And the Germans created this catalog of drawing against National Socialism and terror, and it's in both German and in English. And also, a few years ago, the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. published this book called Art and Politics of Arthur Szyk, and just have to go to Amazon and type in Szyk, and you can get them all less expensive and more quickly than any other way. And I will also say that Joanne Sell, who died a couple of years ago, had been working on a biography of Arthur Szyk. It is marvelous, and he'd been working on this for 20 years. And I said to Joe, you got to finish this, and he did. And it's called Arthur Szyk, Artist, Jew, and Pole, because he loved Poland, land of his birth. He didn't like the anti-Semitism there, but he loved Poland, which he saw as the land of his birth, Israel, the land of his people, and America as the land of his ideals. And Joe does that really well in this biography. So all of these can you obtain on Amazon. They're in the
Please.
bookstore, I should say.
What's your name? They're in the bookstore. What's your name? Ruth Ann, please.
Oh, what was his attitude towards women? Oh, that's great. Because he, in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943 and in his painting in 1945, you'll see women fighters. You'll see images. He illustrated the book of Ruth and the book of Esther. He has women heroines of Deborah and Judith that appear in his art. So, yes, and in his Passover Haggadah, and I know we've said this a few times, that's the book Jews use at the holiday of Passover, you'll see there religious men and religious women, and you'll see secular men and secular women who are going off to the land of Israel in his Passover Haggadah. So, and the first woman member of any cabinet in the United States was under Franklin Roosevelt. Her name was Frances Perkins, and Szyk did a portrait of Frances Perkins that appeared in Fortune magazine.
Yes, some other questions. In the very back there, is that a good seat? Go ahead, please, yeah.
I'm Joanna, and I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the piece that's the example here, and how long something like this might take him to do, and how he worked as an artist.
What was the question? How long did it take him to create?
How long did
Yeah,
someone do a piece
so
like
this work of art, again, which is about this size, well, I won't go into all the details of how I know this, but it took him less than 1 week. 1 week. 1 week. I will tell you details. I know because I met the man who commissioned him to do this work, and I also met his agent who represented him at the time, and both told me independently how long it took him to do this work. And I've talked to people who've watched him work also. These are watercolor and gouache on pen and ink on paper.
Yes, sir, right here.
Roy Fiddler. How did he work with a magnifying glass with one-hair brushes? What was his technique?
Well, I'm going to use this to tie it into our talk too, really. So he never worked with a magnifying glass, but he sometimes worked with thicker glasses, and sometimes he took them off and worked very close. There's different points of view, but the magnifying glass was always at his table for other people to use. To see, and I suspect it was to also magnify. I'm going to now use a little poetry here. I think it was to magnify the issues that he was trying to draw our attention to.
Yes, please.
Why did he work with such a small format? It seems like these would be very 10 feet.
That's correct, and I think I had mentioned earlier that I saw De Profundis as Szyk's Guernica, not only in terms of theme, but also in terms of size. Gosh, if he had done a Guernica that went from, if his De Profundis went from this end of the room to the other, I would, surely people would have paid attention. The billboard that he did of Lincoln that was in Times Square was up there for too short of a period of time, but he was a miniaturist, and medieval manuscript illuminations were miniature, and he chose that because he could deliver a very quick message without much. You knew what he wanted to say, whereas abstract art wouldn't have provided that. And I guess the illuminators of Middle Ages, of Renaissance times and so on, were working small. But all of his art was great for reproduction too. So, if he was creating large canvases and so on, it would be for a unique work, whereas working small, well, he packed it all in, but it had to be reproduced. You know, if you were rich in Renaissance times and had all the villas and all the servants you could have, what would you do with a lot of your money? You might commission a scribe or an artist to illuminate a Bible for you, or a manuscript that you could have in your own home, and that would be for your possession and for your children. You see, Arthur Szyk did the opposite. He did illuminated manuscripts for reproduction so that everyone could have access to them.
Well, as a follow-up, then, wouldn't he be losing detail that he's looking at these things?
Oh, would he be losing, if they were large, you mean, would he be losing?
No. At current magazine reproduction rates, don't you think he's dropping detail from the half-toning and the reproduction process?
When things were reproduced, always they lost detail. Yes, all the time. But
What I'm trying to say is that he's got more detail in his originals that could be properly.
that's correct, and more details in the originals that when you stand up to them, you can fully appreciate in one quick swipe. You must spend time in front of the scribe when you first walk in to the exhibition. I've talked about that piece so many times here, and I've seen it so many times, I've come away thinking that scribe, that Renaissance scribe, with airplanes flying overhead and trains going on, and no, I don't have it here, but in the gallery you'll see that. I've come to the conclusion that's his Mona Lisa.
Irv, can you put that next slide up, actually? That'd be great. And Paul, I just want you to take a look at this slide. Can you talk about it a bit?
These are the Four Freedoms, and that's one of the things that Franklin Roosevelt is most well known for. And that, I think, is the kind of Americanism that Szyk represented. And those are the ideals. And one of the things that socially conscious artists can remind us is that we have those ideals. They also remind us that there remains a gap between our ideals and the daily realities.
I'll just throw in here for educational purposes, you know that Norman Rockwell illustrated the Four Freedoms. Szyk's work, Szyk did the Four Freedoms before Rockwell. I'm not downplaying Rockwell in any way. I just want to say that, while Rockwell was doing the covers of the Saturday Evening Post in the 1940s, and of course afterwards as well, though Szyk didn't live into the 50s, died in 51. The circulation was of the Saturday Evening Post in the 1940s about 3 million. While he was doing those covers, Szyk was doing the covers of Collier's magazine during the war years, showing, Hitler holding Mein Kampf and the devil over his shoulder, or showing the Japanese in the first anniversary bombing of Pearl Harbor. The circulation was of Collier's during that time? 2.5 million. So his art was out there as much as anybody's in terms of for people to see, which was more puzzling that we don't remember him as much.
Yes, and then I want to ask a question, but you go first, please.
My name is David. I know that art is not always used in the service of social justice, but often exactly the opposite. When I think of Chinese art and the Chinese Revolution, or Soviet art to support the Soviet Revolution. And so clearly there's power there, and I'm wondering, this is a more general question. We live in an age where art can be exceptionally powerful because of the medium. And are we seeing artists who are taking advantage, I think of Michael Moore, for example, who are taking advantage of the power of mass media today to get a message out, as opposed to maybe, painting on a piece of paper or on a wall or something? Are there really artists who are trying to get the message out using the internet and the media we have today?
I think we're going to see more and more of that collaborative works on the net, and that the capacity for widespread mass dissemination is there. I think we're going to see that. We've already begun to see that. We see people doing exactly the same thing in film. We see them doing it in music. So this is just one dimension of a much broader tradition of socially conscious creativity. But you're right in your earlier comment. Art is propagandistic, and Arthur Szyk was a propagandist. But you can use visual art for good or for ill. After Stalin took over, following the death of Lenin, you had decades of stifling Soviet socialist realism. There was nothing more than visual productivity on behalf of a totalitarian regime. You certainly had that during the 12 years of the Nazi regime, where technically competent artists were being forced, sometimes not so forced, to using their own often considerable talent on behalf of the Third Reich. And in the United States, our own dimension, it seems to me, is capitalist realism, which we sometimes call advertising.
Another question before I ask it? Yes, you've been waiting patiently.
Hi, my name's Emily. I look around the room and I might be one of the younger people in the audience. No, but and
No offense taken, really.
I was just wondering how we can target more college students in the younger generation to become aware of these issues, such as genocide and other social problems. Because I feel like if you were to go to a gallery, you might already be privileged or aware of some type of issues. So how can we target people from underprivileged backgrounds?
Well, Emily, right?
Yeah.
You're getting at something very important. Naomi, do you want to get in on that? I'd love to hear your take on that.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you from my own background and my experience. So the Project 1 Million Bones was really made to be a tool for the anti-genocide movement in a lot of ways. One is that genocides today aren't seen in the news very much. I wholeheartedly believe that George Clooney had a lot to do with actually highlighting the referendum in Sudan that just happened a couple weeks ago. So how do we get it in the media, local or national? The idea of making bones is pretty weird. It was made to be pretty weird. So when you have community students, young kindergarten classes making bones to talk about values or respect and ethics, or at a high school level talking about genocide, it is actually a space to bring in the local media and to get some press on the issue. There's also the idea, we host bone making events. It's kind of our way to get the project out there. We ask people to host a bone making event and a space to talk about the issue. And the idea is that people may not go to a letter writing party if they hear about it, or a rally, or a place where people are talking about the issue. They may hear from a friend, oh, there's this, event going on, kind of that kind of thing. I don't know, a place where people gather, and so they may more likely be able to do that. The other part is the education, and that's where you really target educators and ask them, we have an activity, we have a program, would you be willing to use this as a way to introduce the issue to your class? And it was very effective both with the Cradle Project talking about orphan children around the world, and the issue of genocide. And the other thing is, I really believe the power of art to bring issues that are very far away from home. And that can mean so many different things, literally far away from where we live, and then bringing it back to home, which is where we place our values and our interest and our concern. Because ultimately, if we are going to move people to action and to be committed and concerned, we have to find a way to bring it home.
Emily, does that work? For you, that answer? So, does the Million Bones interest you?
It does.
Well, would you come to a bones party? Is that what you call it? Yeah, a bones making event? You would. How many people would come to a bones making event? So, a bones making event. What I want to comment on just here, and I think Emily's question, all these questions are very poignant. If Szyk were alive today and here, do you think he'd be most interested in discussing the many fine questions that have been asked, or would he want to know about the Million Bones? And I just want, as a commentary, here we have a person who's everyone. Irv as an antiquarian has now devoted his sort of vocational interest to Arthur Szyk and bringing him to life, but he makes a living as an antiquarian bookseller. Paul, as you can see, is kind of a quiet, reclusive type guy, but who's a passionate activist and calls out on the issues of the day. Naomi's an artist right now, working on this Million Bones project. She's only got 13,000 bones, wants to get 1 million. So Paul, I'm going to ask you, how's she going to go from 13,000 to 1 million?
Well, I think you have to use a variety of mechanisms. Obviously, the social media will play a particularly important role. If it can generate people out in Cairo, you can also get a whole lot of bones. But it's not an easy task to do this. We're still in a severe recession. It's why for people of your generation, They are very concerned about their own economic prospects. I think it's important to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. It's the only thing we can do. You do it for a whole life. Your question is very important. I've had some reasonable success with my own students, but there are thousands of students. You just keep doing it on multifaceted levels. You do it. I just learned about her project today. I'm going to disseminate it as vastly as I possibly can. And these things just kind of cascade. You do it everywhere you possibly can.
You know, I just had an experience yesterday, I think, or the day before, about, people like to do things that makes them feel good. We don't like to do things that make us feel bad. We like to do things that make us feel good. So I was going to Trader Joe's, and somebody was out front, and he had his jacket on, and he was collecting money for some cause. I forgot which one. It was a good cause, I guess. And I said to him, how long have you been doing this? He says, I've been doing this like 13 years, and I put some money into there. And he says, yeah, the reason, I said, why are you doing this? And he said something, I do this because this makes me feel good. And I was thinking, if we could get involved in issues and do them, it would make us feel good.
It feels awfully good. I was showing Naomi at lunch. I'm rereading a book I read many years ago, and I highly recommend it, by Rollo May. Many of you know his work, called The Courage to Create. And I think this book could have been written last night about the challenge that we face in the world of 2011, and it's even a faster-paced world than we wrote it in 1975, of what are the choices are we going to make? Are we going to run away from the issues, or are we going to dive head-on like Szyk did? And again, it's easy to come here now and discuss this. I would assume many people, as you talked about, he was called to the House of Un-American Affairs. Many people didn't like Szyk while he was alive and what he was speaking out about. That I can't imagine. I imagine some people didn't give him a very good reception.
Yeah, I don't think Adolf Hitler would have. I don't think the Japanese would have. Those were the ones who, I think that's a really good question. Maybe I'm so into this so much that I'm not really seeing, who stood up against Arthur Szyk and criticized him in terms of his positions. I don't read that sort of stuff. I haven't seen it. I have access to all of the documents and archives, and I've not really bumped up against that, Lee. I haven't. So I don't know who didn't like Arthur Szyk. It's hard to me, because do you know anybody who didn't like Arthur?
They didn't dislike, the art critics didn't dislike Arthur Szyk per se. They disliked the focus of people like Arthur Szyk. They didn't like, in the early Cold War, they didn't like artists who used their talents to call attention to America's and the world's defects. They wanted nice, safe, abstract works that would also have an extraordinary market. So it's not that there was a great deal of art historical criticism directed specifically toward these people, although there was some directed against people like Ben Shahn and William Gropper and some of the other very politically active Jewish artists. But mostly it was against the tradition, and what they did was to use language like old-fashioned. They used a bunch of disparaging adjectives so that the art world basically moved in the other direction. There has been a qualified reversal. Younger scholars have been moving more toward reacquainting their audiences with the tradition of socially conscious art. So I see that moving slowly, but in a very positive direction.
Here's what I'd like to do, because I'm mindful of time, and before I make just a final comment, I want to ask each of our panelists, you have max of 1 minute, and in that minute, I'd like you to, because there's so much to say about Szyk, to list 3 things you would like all of us to leave here today thinking about or to go out and do. And we'll go Paul, Naomi. 1 minute, 3 things you'd like us to be thinking about as a result of being here with you today or going out and do.
Okay, I'm going to answer that by saying why Arthur Szyk's important to me and why I'm so interested in his art. And I think that will cover those 3 things. And that is that I love Arthur Szyk's art because I found that his value system was closest to my value system, and it was closest to every thinking, thoughtful person. And what do I mean by that is, is that here is an artist, as you've heard so many times, is a Jewish artist, and he cared about Jewish issues his entire life. He devoted himself to Jewish rescue and to the creation of the state of Israel. And then here was an artist, number two, who used his art to be an advocate for humanity at large. And he went into his own value system, fighting against oppression and tyranny, and he translated those Jewish values into democratic ideals. So that during the war years, he raised money for the Chinese, and the Czechs, and the Poles, and the tattered Brits, and the Australian soldiers, and the soldiers from New Zealand, which says to me that one should use their own value system and to figure out how one can apply that to be an advocate for humanity, and with number three, to make the world a better place. And that number three says to me that no matter who you are, whether you're a Jew,